I spent much of my childhood adrift. My father had left my mother and me when I was 2 years old. My mother remarried and we moved overseas for a time, but I was mostly raised in Hawaii by my mom and my grandparents, who were from Kansas. And growing up, I wasn't always sure of who I was or where I was going. That's what happens sometimes when you don't have a father in the home. But during my first 2 years of college, perhaps because the values my mother had taught me, values of hard work and honesty and empathy, perhaps because they had resurfaced after a long hibernation, or perhaps because of the example of wonderful teachers and lasting friends, I began to notice a world beyond myself. And by the time I graduated from college, I was possessed with a crazy idea that I would work at the grassroots level to bring about change. So I wrote letters to every organization in the country I could think of. And one day, a small group of churches on the south side of Chicago offered me a job working to help neighborhoods that had been devastated by the steel plants that had closed in the early and mid-'80s. Now, my mother and my grandparents thought it might be wiser for me to go to law school. My friends were all applying for jobs on Wall Street. And meanwhile, this organization offered me $12,000 a year. They gave me $2,000 for all my car expenses for the next several years. And I said yes. I said yes. I didn't know a soul in Chicago. I wasn't sure what was waiting for me when I got there. I'd always been inspired by the stories of the civil rights movement and JFK's call to service. But when I got to the South Side, there were no marches, there were no soaring speeches. In the shadows of an empty steel plant, there were just a lot of people who were struggling. And I still remember one of the very first meetings we put together. I was working with lay leaders from churches in the neighborhoods to try to forge this coalition. People had decided that the issue of gang violence was critical. And so they wanted to hold a community meeting to address gang violence. And we put out thousands of flyers, and we made phone calls to everybody we knew in the community. And the night of the meeting happens, and we put out hundreds of chairs like this, and we wait, and we wait for people to show up. And finally, this group of older people walk into the hall, and I'm relieved at least somebody's showing up. And they sit down, and a little old lady, she raises her hand, and she asks, when's the bingo starting? That was my first meeting as a community organizer, my first venture into community service. And it wasn't easy. There were times where it was extraordinarily discouraging, but eventually we made progress. Day by day, block by block, we brought the community together. We registered new voters. We set up after-school programs and fought for new jobs and helped people live the lives in these communities with more opportunity and some measure of dignity.